The blazing Pacific sun hammered down mercilessly as Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai peered through the cockpit glass. His weathered hands gripped the control stick of his Mitsubishi A6M0. The sky stretched endlessly blue above Rabaul. August heat shimmered off the aircraft's metal skin. Sakai was no ordinary pilot. Over 60 Allied aircraft had fallen to his guns. Each victory carved another notch in his legendary reputation. His Zero responded like an extension of his own body. Every slight movement of the stick translated into graceful flight. The machine felt alive beneath him. Deadly, precise, beautiful in its simplicity. But something unusual caught his attention this morning. Strange aircraft were rising from the distant horizon. Their silhouettes looked wrong, unfamiliar. These weren't the familiar shapes he'd grown accustomed to destroying over 2 brutal years of Pacific warfare. Gone were the recognizable outlines of P-40 Warhawks. Missing were the stubby profiles of F-4F Wildcats. Those aircraft he knew intimately. He understood their weaknesses, their limitations, their predictable flight patterns. He could outmaneuver them blindfolded. These new machines defied everything he knew about enemy fighters. They appeared massive, ungainly, almost grotesque in their bulk, like flying freight trains rather than sleek fighters. His wingman's voice crackled through the primitive radio system. Flight Petty Officer Hiroshi Nishizawa sounded puzzled, confused. "What are those things?" Static filled the transmission. The radio equipment was ancient by any standard, unreliable at best. Sakai squinted harder at the approaching formation. Each aircraft seemed impossibly large, at least twice the bulk of his nimble Zero, perhaps more. Their wings looked thick and stubby. Their fuselages appeared bloated, swollen beyond reason. Everything about these aircraft suggested weakness, clumsiness. They should be sitting ducks for experienced Japanese pilots. Easy prey for the masters of aerial combat. The Zero had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. No Allied fighter could match its performance. "American pigs," Sakai radioed back with casual confidence. His voice carried the arrogance of countless victories. "Heavy and stupid. We'll make quick work of them." Confidence flowed through his words like warm sake. He'd destroyed so many enemy aircraft that this seemed routine. Another easy morning's work. More victories to add to his growing tally. What Sakai couldn't possibly know changed everything. He was about to encounter the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. This massive American fighter would shatter every assumption Japanese pilots held sacred about aerial warfare. The Thunderbolt embodied a completely different philosophy. American designers hadn't prioritized grace or elegance. They'd focused on raw survival, brutal effectiveness, the ability to absorb punishment and dish out devastating retaliation. This clash represented more than aircraft meeting in combat. 2 entire nations' approaches to warfare were about to collide. The outcome would reshape the Pacific War forever. The story behind this confrontation began far from any battlefield. In design studios and factory floors across 2 continents. Engineers and planners had made crucial decisions years earlier. Those choices were now bearing deadly fruit. Japanese aircraft design in the late 1930s followed a clear philosophy. Tensions were mounting across the Pacific. War clouds gathered ominously on the horizon. Japanese designers pursued the lessons learned in their ongoing China conflict. The Mitsubishi A6M0 first took to the skies in 1939. It embodied every principle Japanese engineers held dear. Extreme lightness governed every design decision. Exceptional maneuverability came first. long-range capabilities enabled far-reaching missions. Every unnecessary pound was eliminated ruthlessly. Weight was the enemy of performance. The lighter the aircraft, the better it could dance through the sky. The more gracefully it could outmaneuver opponents. Designer Jiro Horikoshi had created what many considered perfection. The Zero weighed just 5,300 pounds fully loaded. It could outmaneuver any fighter on Earth. Its turning radius was impossibly tight. Its climb rate exceeded all competitors. Range capabilities seemed almost magical. Over 1,900 miles without refueling. This allowed escort missions that Western planners considered impossible. Bombers could strike targets previously beyond reach. The Zero made Japan's ambitious Pacific strategy feasible. In skilled hands, this aircraft had achieved total air superiority. From Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies, across thousands of square miles of ocean. Allied pilots had learned to fear the distinctive silhouette. The Zero's reputation spread like wildfire through Allied squadrons. But this performance extracted a terrible price, one that would prove fatal as the war dragged on. To achieve such remarkable lightness, Japanese designers had made crucial sacrifices. They'd eliminated armor protection for pilots. Fuel tanks lacked self-sealing capabilities. Critical components remained unprotected. The Zero was built for an earlier era of warfare, when aerial combat resembled medieval duels. Individual pilots engaged in graceful dances of death. Skill and maneuverability determined outcomes. Honor mattered more than survival. Across the Pacific, American thinking evolved differently. Aircraft designers led by visionaries like Alexander Kartveli saw the future more clearly. They understood that modern air wars would be brutal affairs of attrition. Industrial capacity would matter more than individual skill. The P-47 Thunderbolt first flew in May 1941. It represented the ultimate expression of American design philosophy. Where Japanese aircraft prioritized grace, Americans chose raw power. Where Zeros emphasized lightness, Thunderbolts embraced weight. The massive fighter weighed over 17,000 pounds fully loaded, more than 3 times heavier than a Zero. This seemed like madness to traditional fighter thinking. How could such a behemoth compete with graceful Japanese fighters? The answer lay in the Thunderbolt's massive Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine. This powerhouse produced 2,000 horsepower. It was one of the most powerful single-engine installations ever created. Raw power compensated for weight penalties. But brute force was only part of the equation. The Thunderbolt was designed from the ground up to keep pilots alive. Survival trumped elegance every time. American engineers understood that dead pilots couldn't pass on hard-won experience. The cockpit sat surrounded by thick armor plating. Rifle bullets bounced off harmlessly. Shell fragments couldn't penetrate the protection. The pilot remained safe inside his armored cocoon. Fuel tanks incorporated self-sealing technology. When punctured by enemy fire, they closed automatically. Fires couldn't start from leaking aviation fuel. The aircraft could absorb tremendous punishment and keep flying. The massive radial engine sat behind a heavy firewall. This barrier could absorb cannon shells and keep functioning. Critical engine components remained protected from enemy fire. The power plant continued running despite severe damage. The contrast between design philosophies was absolutely stark. Where Zeros appeared elegant and refined, Thunderbolts looked brutal and utilitarian. Japanese fighters relied on pilot skill to avoid damage. American fighters were built to absorb punishment and survive. This difference reflected broader strategic realities facing both nations. Japan possessed limited industrial capacity. Their population remained relatively small. They needed to maximize effectiveness from each individual pilot and aircraft. The Zero's exceptional performance allowed small numbers of highly trained pilots to dominate vast areas. Quality compensated for quantity limitations. Elite pilots in superior aircraft could achieve remarkable results against numerical disadvantages. But this strategy contained fatal flaws. It depended entirely on maintaining pilot quality and aircraft technological superiority. Losses couldn't be easily replaced. Training programs couldn't expand rapidly. Industrial capacity remained limited. The United States approached warfare from a position of strength. Massive industrial capacity could produce aircraft in unprecedented numbers. Large population meant unlimited pilot training potential. Quantity would eventually overwhelm quality. American planners understood the mathematics of attrition warfare. They needed aircraft that could survive long enough for numerical superiority to take effect. Pilot survival mattered more than individual aircraft performance. By 1943, these competing philosophies were ready for their ultimate test. The collision would prove devastating for one side, vindication for the other. Japanese forces were already feeling the strain of prolonged warfare. Their pool of experienced pilots shrank with each passing month. Combat losses couldn't be easily replaced. Training programs faced severe resource constraints. Replacement pilots received increasingly abbreviated instruction. The war situation deteriorated constantly. Quality standards dropped from necessity. New pilots entered combat with minimal experience. Survival rates plummeted accordingly. Meanwhile, American training programs hit their full stride. Massive facilities produced thousands of new pilots monthly. Aircraft factories operated at unprecedented capacity. Production rates seemed impossible to Japanese observers. The P-47 Thunderbolt was reaching combat units in growing numbers. Its impact would be immediate and decisive. Early encounters over Europe had proven the concept. German fighters had learned to respect the massive American aircraft, but the Pacific theater provided the ultimate testing ground. Here, legendary Zeros and expert pilots awaited. The Thunderbolt would face its greatest challenge. American design philosophy would be tested against Japanese aerial mastery. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group experienced the P-47's capabilities firsthand over Europe. His initial reaction mixed skepticism with amazement. The transition felt jarring after smaller fighters. It was like going from a sports car to a truck, Johnson recalled later. The massive fighter seemed impossibly heavy. Climb rates appeared sluggish. Maneuverability felt limited. How could anyone dogfight in such a beast? Johnson's opinion changed dramatically after his first serious combat encounter. Flying over France in June 1943, German Focke-Wulf 190s attacked his formation. Multiple fighters concentrated their fire on his aircraft. The punishment seemed overwhelming. Cannon shells punched through wings and fuselage. Machine gun bullets peppered the aircraft from nose to tail. Engine cowling took direct hits from explosive rounds. Any normal fighter would have disintegrated instantly. Instead, Johnson's Thunderbolt absorbed the damage stoically. The massive radial engine continued running despite multiple cannon impacts. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires. Armor protection stopped bullets that would have killed pilots in other aircraft. Johnson managed to escape and return to base safely. Ground crews counted over 200 bullet and shell holes. The aircraft looked like a flying colander. Yet critical systems remained functional. Repairs took only days to complete. The incident became legendary among American pilots. The P-47's reputation for survivability spread rapidly through combat units. Pilots gained confidence knowing their aircraft could bring them home regardless of battle damage. This reputation was about to face its ultimate test. Japanese aces had built their careers on precision shooting. They assumed a few well-placed shots could destroy any aircraft. Experience reinforced this belief constantly. Lightweight Allied fighters encountered in early war years had validated Japanese tactics. P-40s and F-4Fs could be destroyed by relatively minor damage. Critical hits meant instant victory. Japanese training emphasized precision over volume of fire. The Zero's armament reflected this philosophy perfectly. Two 20mm cannons provided precision firepower. Two 7.7mm machine guns added supplementary damage. Light by American standards, but adequate for destroying fragile enemy aircraft. Japanese pilots trained to target specific vulnerable areas. Engine compartments offered quick kills. Fuel systems meant fiery destruction. Pilot areas ended fights instantly. Surgical precision trumped brute force every time. But the P-47 Thunderbolt challenged every assumption about aerial combat. American fighters could absorb damage that destroyed other aircraft. Heavy construction meant survivability. Robust systems provided redundancy. The Thunderbolt's armament delivered devastating firepower. 850 caliber machine guns carried 3,400 rounds of ammunition. This represented tremendous destructive potential. Even brief firing opportunities could prove decisive. More importantly, the aircraft embodied a fundamental shift in American warfare thinking. Instead of avoiding hits, American fighters were designed to survive hits and retaliate. This represented a complete reversal of traditional fighter philosophy. The strategy would prove devastatingly effective against lightly built Japanese aircraft. American industrial might was about to demonstrate its superiority over Japanese martial tradition, but the transition wouldn't be immediate or easy. American pilots needed to learn new tactics for their massive fighters. Japanese pilots would have to adapt to enemies that refused to die. The first major test came during summer 1943. P-47s began arriving in the Pacific Theater in significant numbers. The 348th Fighter Group, based in New Guinea, was among the first units to receive the new fighters. Their mission involved escorting bombing raids and engaging enemy fighters. Group Commander Colonel Neil Kirby initially expressed skepticism about the P-47's Pacific capabilities. The aircraft's size and weight seemed poorly suited to tropical conditions. Long-range missions posed unique challenges. The Zero's reputation remained legendary. Many Allied pilots wondered how the massive Thunderbolt could compete in aerial combat. Traditional thinking favored lightweight, maneuverable fighters. The P-47 seemed to violate every principle of successful fighter design. But Kirby and his pilots were about to discover that apparent disadvantages were actually strengths in disguise. The aircraft's weight provided tremendous advantages in diving attacks. Physics favored the heavier aircraft. Thunderbolts could dive faster than any Japanese fighter. This allowed American pilots to engage and disengage at will. They controlled the terms of combat. Traditional dogfighting became obsolete. The aircraft's heavy armament meant brief firing opportunities could be decisive. Where Zero pilots needed extended maneuvering to line up killing shots, P-47 pilots could destroy enemies with short bursts. Concentrated firepower replaced extended combat. The psychological effect on Japanese pilots was immediate and profound. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese aces faced enemies that seemed immune to traditional tactics. Aircraft that should have been destroyed by accurate shooting continued fighting. Confidence began eroding among veteran Japanese pilots. The rules of aerial combat were changing. Enemies no longer played by established conventions. Victory was no longer assured for skilled pilots in superior aircraft. The implications extended far beyond individual encounters. P-47 survivability meant experienced American pilots were more likely to survive combat. Knowledge could be passed to newer pilots. Training effectiveness improved dramatically. Japanese aces accustomed to quick victories found themselves in prolonged combat. Extended engagements increased their own risk of being shot down. The mathematics of attrition were shifting decisively. In warfare based on attrition, survivable aircraft and pilot retention determined ultimate victory. The P-47 Thunderbolt represented American industry's answer to Japanese aerial expertise. That answer was proving devastatingly effective, but the full impact remained to be felt. As more P-47s arrived and American pilots gained experience, the balance would shift dramatically. Japanese aces who had dominated Pacific skies were about to discover their era was ending. The stage was set for aerial battles, demonstrating American industrial triumph over Japanese martial tradition. Both sides would need to adapt to new forms of warfare. Survival mattered as much as skill. Absorbing punishment became as valuable as delivering it. The encounters that followed would forever change both nations' approaches to fighter design and aerial combat. For Japan, harsh lessons in industrial warfare awaited. For America, vindication of design philosophy, prioritizing pilot survival over traditional performance measures. The thunder of P-47 engines announced a new era in Pacific air warfare. American fighters would no longer be hunted. They would become the hunters. The question remained whether Japanese pilots could adapt to enemies that absorbed their best efforts and struck back with overwhelming force. October 11, 1943, dawned crystal clear over Wewak, New Guinea. Morning sunlight painted the sky brilliant gold. Colonel Neil Kirby adjusted his oxygen mask carefully. Instrument readings looked normal across the board. He was leading 4 P-47 Thunderbolts toward their assigned patrol area. Intelligence reports indicated large Japanese fighter formations operating nearby. Kirby felt eager anticipation building in his chest. This would be the ultimate test. His massive fighters against the legendary Zero in actual combat conditions. At 29,000 feet, the Thunderbolts had climbed to altitudes impossible for most earlier Allied fighters. The P-47's turbo-supercharged engine actually thrived in thin air. This gave American fighters a significant altitude advantage over Japanese opponents. This represented the first hint of how radically different this encounter would be. Traditional aerial battles occurred at lower altitudes. The P-47's high-altitude capabilities changed fundamental combat dynamics. "Bandits, 2 o'clock low," Lieutenant William Dunham called out clearly. Kirby's wingman had spotted the enemy formation first. Below them, 12 Japanese fighters climbed steadily toward what they assumed would be another easy victory. Leading the Japanese formation was Flight Petty Officer Tetsuo Iwamoto. This veteran ace had over 80 confirmed victories to his credit. He'd been flying Zeros since Pearl Harbor. No American fighter had ever matched his aircraft's performance. As Iwamoto spotted the approaching P-47s, familiar confidence surged through his veins. The feeling had carried him through dozens of successful combats. Victory seemed assured once again, but something felt wrong about this encounter. The American fighters weren't behaving like previous Allied aircraft. Instead of turning to fight at the Zero's preferred altitude and speed, the P-47s maintained their height advantage stubbornly. They began executing high-speed diving attacks that caught the Japanese formation completely off guard. This wasn't traditional aerial combat. The Americans were rewriting the rules of engagement. Kirby rolled his massive fighter into a steep dive. The Thunderbolt's weight carried it to speeds no Zero could match. Japanese fighters designed for maneuverability found themselves unable to escape the diving Americans. Physics worked against the lighter Japanese aircraft. Their advantages in turning combat became meaningless. Speed and altitude determined outcomes now. The Americans controlled both factors completely. Kirby's 850 caliber machine guns opened fire at close range. Their combined firepower equaled a small artillery piece. The effect was absolutely devastating on the lightweight Zero. Iwamoto watched in complete shock as his wingman's aircraft simply disintegrated. The Zero's lightweight construction offered no protection against the massive bullets tearing through its structure. Within seconds, the graceful fighter became falling wreckage. But Iwamoto's shock turned to disbelief when he managed to get his guns on one attacking P-47. His 20mm cannon scored multiple direct hits on the American fighter's fuselage and wings. These impacts should have been instantly fatal. Instead, the Thunderbolt absorbed the punishment completely. It continued its attack seemingly unaffected by damage that would have destroyed a Zero instantly. The American pilot didn't even seem to notice the hits. "Impossible," Iwamoto muttered into his radio as he watched cannon shells explode harmlessly against the P-47's armored structure. This defied everything he understood about aerial combat. Aircraft were supposed to be fragile, vulnerable, easy to destroy with accurate shooting. This was Lieutenant Dunham's aircraft demonstrating Thunderbolt survivability firsthand. Japanese cannon shells had punched holes through wings and fuselage, but the aircraft's robust construction and redundant systems kept it flying normally. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires despite multiple punctures. Armored cockpit protection kept the pilot safe. The massive radial engine continued running despite taking several direct hits. Every system was designed for survival. Dunham completed his attack run and began climbing back to altitude. His damaged but functional P-47 demonstrated the fundamental difference between design philosophies. American aircraft were built to survive hits and keep fighting. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was immediate and devastating. For 2 years, they had dominated Pacific skies through superior performance and skill. The Zero's maneuverability had made them feel invincible in aerial combat. Now they faced an enemy that seemed immune to their traditional advantages. Everything they'd learned about air warfare was being challenged. Their expertise meant nothing against opponents who refused to die. Iwamoto tried engaging the climbing P-47 in turning combat. This was the Zero's greatest strength. But Dunham refused to be drawn into maneuvering fights that favored the Japanese fighter. Instead, he used superior speed and climb rate to maintain the initiative. This was entirely new aerial warfare. Vertical fighting replaced horizontal maneuvering. American pilots controlled engagement terms completely. Traditional dogfighting with its emphasis on turning ability became obsolete overnight. The battle continued for nearly 20 minutes. This was an eternity in aerial combat terms. Most encounters lasted only minutes before being decided. But the P-47 survivability extended combat duration dramatically. Kirby and his 3 wingmen used their altitude advantage and superior speed to make repeated diving attacks. Each attack resulted in at least one Zero being shot down or severely damaged. The P-47s absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any other Allied fighter. By the encounter's end, Kirby's small formation had destroyed 6 Japanese fighters without losing a single aircraft. More importantly, they had demonstrated that Japanese air superiority was ending forever. The P-47 Thunderbolt represented a new generation of American fighters. These aircraft could not only match Japanese fighters in combat, but decisively defeat them. The era of zero dominance was coming to its inevitable close. The waves of change crashed through both air forces like a tsunami of revelation. American commanders finally held proof in their hands. Their new fighters could demolish the legendary Zero. Their tactics worked. The myth was broken. Japanese leadership faced a terrifying truth. This encounter was just the beginning. More P-47s were crossing the Pacific. Disaster was coming. Flight Petty Officer Iwamoto made it back to base alive. But something inside him had died. His confidence lay in pieces like his shattered cockpit glass. He sat in the debriefing room. His hands still trembled slightly. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like water bursting through a dam. The American fighters were flying fortresses. That's how he described them. Metal beasts that laughed at Japanese bullets. His report detailed something impossible. The P-47 had absorbed hit after hit. Cannon shells, machine gun bursts. Nothing stopped it. The massive fighter kept coming. Keep fighting. Kept winning. Japanese intelligence officers read his report with growing disbelief. They shook their heads, frowned at the pages. This couldn't be true. No single engine fighter possessed such armor. No aircraft could survive that much damage. Iwamoto must have been mistaken. Battle shock, perhaps. Fear playing tricks on his memory. But then more reports arrived. Different pilots. Same impossible stories. Zero after zero was falling to these armored giants. American fighters that should have been dead kept fighting. Japanese bullets seemed to bounce off their thick hides like raindrops on stone. Pilots who had dominated Pacific skies found themselves helpless. These encounters dragged on far longer than any Japanese pilot expected. Quick, decisive victories became grinding battles of attrition. The Americans refused to die. They absorbed punishment that would have killed any other fighter. Then, they struck back with devastating force. 8 heavy machine guns spoke death in a language Japanese pilots couldn't answer. The psychological damage cut deeper than any physical wound. Japanese pilots had learned one fundamental truth. A few accurate shots would destroy any enemy aircraft. This knowledge was their foundation, their confidence, their entire approach to combat. When that truth crumbled, everything else fell apart. Their most precise gunnery failed against the P-47s. Shots that should have been fatal merely scratched paint. Attacks that should have ended fights barely slowed the massive Americans down. Japanese pilots began doubting their weapons, their training, their ability to win this war. Fear crept into cockpits where only confidence had lived before. Colonel Kirby's victory on October 11th opened floodgates. More P-47 groups poured into the Pacific theater like steel rain. The encounters multiplied. The pattern repeated everywhere. American fighters dominated skies where Japanese Zeros had once ruled supreme. The 35th Fighter Group established bases in New Guinea's steaming jungles. Humidity hung like wet blankets over their airstrips. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, but their P-47s cut through Japanese formations with mechanical precision. Kill ratios climbed steadily upward. American pilots returned home with growing confidence. From the Marshall Islands, the 318th Fighter Group launched their armored giants into combat. Their newly captured airfields still smelled of cordite and burned fuel. Japanese defenders had fought hard for these strips. Now, American fighters used them as launching pads for attacks deeper into enemy territory. The irony was bitter for Japanese planners watching from distant headquarters. P-47s penetrated air defenses that had been considered impregnable. They flew through flak fields that should have shredded lighter aircraft. Anti-aircraft guns blazed upward in desperate fury. Shells burst around the incoming Americans, but the Thunderbolts kept coming. Their armor shrugged off fragments that would have doomed other fighters. The most revolutionary change was pilot survival rates. American fighter pilots had faced grim mathematics in 1942. Flying against the superior Zero meant accepting terrible odds. Death was the most likely outcome of any encounter. Experienced pilots were precious resources that couldn't be replaced quickly. Every loss was a catastrophe for American air power. The P-47 transformed this equation completely. Pilots who took severe damage still made it home. Aircraft that should have been total losses landed on friendly airfields. Mechanics stared in amazement at bullet holes and shell damage that any other fighter couldn't have survived. The Thunderbolts brought their pilots back alive. This survival advantage created cascading effects throughout American air power. Experienced pilots lived to share hard-won knowledge with newer aviators. Combat veterans passed on lessons that could only be learned in actual battle. The institutional knowledge of American fighter squadrons grew exponentially. Each surviving pilot became a teacher for the next generation. Japanese aviation faced the opposite trend. Their aces were dying at alarming rates. Pilots who had survived years of combat fell to Americans who had been flying for months. The pool of experienced Japanese aviators shrank with each passing week. Training programs couldn't replace this expertise fast enough. Knowledge died with every fallen ace. The mathematical reality was stark and undeniable. In 1942, Japanese pilots achieved kill ratios of 10-to-1 or better against Allied fighters. Their Zeros carved through American formations like swords through paper. Allied pilots faced overwhelming disadvantages in aircraft performance and pilot experience. The numbers told a story of Japanese dominance. By late 1943, those numbers had not only equalized, but completely reversed. P-47s entering service in massive numbers changed everything. American pilots now achieved kill ratios of 3-to-1 or better against Japanese fighters. The advantage had shifted decisively. Superior equipment combined with improving tactics created American superiority. Japanese leaders scrambled to respond to this new threat, but their options were severely limited. Industrial capacity was already stretched to breaking points. Strategic materials were increasingly scarce. The resources needed to develop new aircraft simply didn't exist. Japan was fighting a war of attrition it couldn't win. American industry was just hitting its stride. Factories produced aircraft at rates Japanese planners considered impossible. New designs were already on drawing boards. The P-47 was just the beginning. More advanced fighters would soon join the Thunderbolt squadrons. American technological superiority was accelerating. The Zero had reached the end of its development potential. The aircraft that seemed so advanced in 1941 was now revealed as a product of outdated thinking. Pre-war design philosophy had no place in the industrial warfare of 1943. The Zero's creators had optimized it perfectly for the wrong kind of war. Attempts to upgrade the Zero failed repeatedly. Engineers tried adding heavier armament and armor protection, but the aircraft's basic design couldn't accommodate additional weight. Every improvement compromised the performance characteristics that made the Zero effective. Japanese engineers found themselves trapped by their own earlier success. The Zero was so perfectly optimized for its original mission that fundamental changes were impossible. Weight and balance parameters left no room for modification. The airframe couldn't handle more powerful engines. Structural limitations prevented meaningful armor installation. The Zero was a technological dead end. American aircraft designers faced no such constraints. They were already working on fighters that would make the P-47 look obsolete. The P-51 Mustang was taking shape in wind tunnels and test flights. Its combination of speed, range, and maneuverability would soon revolutionize escort fighter operations. American innovation was just beginning to accelerate. The F-4U Corsair was proving devastatingly effective in Marine and Navy hands. Its distinctive bent wings and massive engine made it instantly recognizable. More importantly, it was killing Japanese aircraft at unprecedented rates. The Corsair's speed and firepower created new tactical possibilities for American pilots. But it was the P-47 that had shattered Japanese air supremacy in the Pacific. The massive fighter's ability to absorb punishment and deliver overwhelming firepower changed aerial combat forever. Rules that had governed fighter operations for decades became obsolete overnight. The Thunderbolt wrote new rules that favored armor over agility. Japanese pilots, who had hunted Allied fighters with complete impunity, now found themselves the hunted. Every mission brought encounters with enemies that seemed to grow stronger each month. The psychological pressure was enormous. Pilots who had once eagerly sought combat now flew each mission knowing death was the most likely outcome. The human cost was staggering on both sides. Japanese aces who had survived years of combat were being shot down by American pilots with only months of experience. The expertise that had taken Japan years to develop was being destroyed faster than it could be replaced. Each fallen ace was irreplaceable. American pilots still faced constant danger despite their superior aircraft. The P-47's survivability didn't make combat safe or easy. Japanese opposition remained fierce and determined. Anti-aircraft fire still filled the skies with deadly fragments. Combat flying in hostile environments thousands of miles from home created constant stress. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski of the 56th Fighter Group represented the new generation of American aces. His approach differed completely from earlier fighter pilots. Individual heroics mattered less than systematic tactics. Teamwork replaced lone wolf approaches. Intelligence use of superior equipment became the key to success. The P-47 wasn't a dogfighter in traditional terms. Gabreski understood this completely. His aircraft possessed other advantages that mattered more. Speed allowed him to dictate engagement terms. Firepower could destroy enemies quickly. Armor brought him home alive. These advantages required intelligent application. Gabreski emphasized avoiding turning fights where enemies might have advantages. The P-47's superior performance characteristics should be used systematically. Speed for positioning. Firepower for killing. Armor for surviving. This wasn't romantic aerial combat. It was warfare as engineering problem-solving. This systematic approach reflected broader changes in American military thinking. The romantic notion of individual aerial duels was dying. Professional approaches emphasized training, teamwork, and intelligent use of superior equipment. Victory came through systematic application of advantages rather than individual heroics. Japanese military culture struggled with this new reality. Their entire philosophy was built on different foundations. Individual excellence mattered more than equipment. Spiritual superiority could overcome material disadvantages. Willpower could triumph over technological inferiority. These beliefs ran counter to everything the P-47 represented. The idea that superior equipment could overcome superior skill was alien to Japanese thinking. Their samurai traditions emphasized personal excellence over material advantages. But industrial warfare was proving these traditions obsolete. Technology and resources were becoming more important than individual courage and skill. As 1943 ended, The P-47 Thunderbolt's impact on Pacific air warfare was undeniable. Japanese air power that had seemed invincible 2 years earlier was being systematically destroyed. American fighters embodied a completely different approach to aerial combat. The question was no longer whether Americans could achieve air superiority. The only remaining question was how quickly they could complete the destruction of Japanese air power. The answer would come in the massive air battles of 1944. American forces were preparing for the final drive toward Japan itself. The P-47 would play a crucial role in clearing skies for the bombers. More battles lay ahead. More encounters between lightweight Japanese fighters and armored American giants. Each engagement would further demonstrate American design philosophy superiority over Japanese martial traditions. Industrial might was proving more decisive than warrior spirit. The thunder of P-47 engines had become the sound of American victory in Pacific skies. That sound would grow louder as more Thunderbolts arrived. Japanese pilots would learn to fear that distinctive rumble. It announced the arrival of fighters they couldn't defeat. By January 1944, legends of the indestructible P-47 Thunderbolt spread throughout the Pacific theater like wildfire, consuming dry grass. Ready rooms from Australia to the Aleutians buzzed with incredible stories. American pilots swapped tales of Thunderbolts returning from combat, with damage that defied belief. Wings riddled with holes, engines smoking and sputtering, control surfaces shot away. Yet, still flying, still fighting, still bringing their pilots home. Japanese pilots found themselves confronting an enemy that mocked their fundamental understanding of aerial warfare. Everything they had learned about combat was being turned upside down. Aircraft were supposed to be fragile things. A few well-placed shots should bring down any fighter. But these American monsters seemed immune to damage that should have been instantly fatal. Captain Hiroyoshi Nishizawa experienced this frustration personally during a mission over Rabaul in February 1944. The humid air hung thick over the Solomon Islands. Tropical heat shimmered off metal runways. Palm trees swayed in gentle breezes that did nothing to cool the oppressive atmosphere. But weather was the least of anyone's concerns as formations of aircraft prepared for another deadly encounter. Nishizawa was known throughout Japanese aviation as the Devil. His exceptional skill and aggressive tactics had made him a legend. Over 100 confirmed victories decorated his record. He had survived encounters that killed lesser pilots. His reputation inspired confidence in subordinates and fear in enemies. But reputation meant nothing against the new American fighters. Leading a formation of 8 Zeros, Nishizawa intercepted a group of P-47s escorting B-25 bombers. The American bombers were heading for Japanese shipping in Simpson Harbor. Their twin engines droned steadily through tropical air. Bomb bay doors hung heavy with high explosives intended for Japanese vessels. The engagement began according to traditional patterns. Japanese fighters used their superior maneuverability to position themselves for attacks on the American formation. The Zeros climbed and dove, twisted and turned, sought the perfect angles for devastating passes. This was the kind of combat Japanese pilots understood completely. Nishizawa selected what appeared to be a damaged P-47 trailing smoke and struggling to maintain formation. The massive fighter seemed wounded, vulnerable, an easy target for someone with his experience and skill. Black smoke streamed from the engine cowling. The aircraft wallowed slightly in the air, perfect prey for a predator like Nishizawa. What the Japanese ace didn't realize was that he was attacking Major Robert Johnson, the same pilot who had survived devastating attacks over Europe months earlier. Johnson's P-47 was indeed damaged. Anti-aircraft fire had punctured his oil cooler. Engine temperatures were climbing dangerously, but the Thunderbolt was still fully capable of defending itself. As Nishizawa closed for what he expected to be an easy kill, Johnson suddenly rolled his damaged Thunderbolt into a diving turn. The maneuver caught the Japanese ace completely off guard. He had expected a wounded animal. Instead, he faced a wounded tiger that still possessed deadly claws. The P-47's 850 caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously. Streams of armor-piercing bullets tore through the Zero's lightweight structure like paper. The Japanese fighter had no armor protection, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no redundant systems. It was built for speed and maneuverability at the expense of everything else. Against the P-47's massive firepower, these compromises proved fatal. Nishizawa's aircraft disintegrated around him. Wings folded backward under the stress of multiple impacts. The fuselage split open like a rotten fruit. Fire erupted from ruptured fuel lines. The Zero that had carried him through over 100 victories became his tomb in mere seconds. The devil had met a demon he couldn't exorcise. The psychological impact of losing such a skilled pilot to what appeared to be a damaged American fighter was devastating for Japanese morale. If Nishizawa could be shot down so easily, what hope did lesser pilots have? The invincibility that had surrounded Japanese aces was evaporating like morning mist under tropical sun. But the P-47's impact extended far beyond individual aerial encounters. The aircraft's exceptional range and payload capacity made it an ideal fighter-bomber. It could carry bombs and rockets to targets deep in Japanese-held territory. Its armor protection allowed it to survive defensive fire that would destroy other aircraft. American commanders quickly recognized these capabilities. The Thunderbolt's survivability made it perfect for ground attack missions that would have been suicidal for other fighters. Close air support, interdiction strikes, armed reconnaissance. The P-47 could handle missions that required flying through intense defensive fire. The 348th Fighter Group, now fully equipped with P-47s, began conducting train-busting missions against Japanese supply lines. These operations required flying at low altitude through valleys and mountain passes. Anti-aircraft guns waited at every turn. Machine gun nests covered every approach. But the Thunderbolts pressed through defenses that would have stopped other aircraft. Flying barely above treetop level, P-47 pilots strafed Japanese convoys, moving supplies to forward positions. Trucks exploded under machine gun fire. Fuel dumps erupted in towering fireballs. Supply depots disappeared under rocket attacks. The aircraft's armor allowed pilots to press attacks home despite heavy ground fire. These ground attack missions had cumulative effects that were perhaps more important than the P-47's air-to-air victories. Japanese forces throughout the Pacific found their supply lines under constant attack. Convoys that had previously moved with relative security now faced devastating strikes from aircraft that seemed immune to defensive fire. Ships trying to resupply isolated garrisons came under attack from fighters that could absorb anti-aircraft fire and continue their assault. Airfields faced repeated strikes from aircraft that could penetrate defenses and escape with minimal damage. The Japanese logistics network was being systematically strangled by fighters that couldn't be stopped. The Japanese response was hampered by their deteriorating industrial situation and catastrophic pilot losses. New aircraft coming off production lines were increasingly inferior to their American counterparts. Substitute materials replaced high-grade steel and aluminum. Inexperienced workers built aircraft with declining quality standards. Pilot training programs that had once been the pride of Japanese military aviation were being shortened desperately. The need for replacement pilots became so urgent that training standards dropped precipitously. New pilots received a fraction of the flight time that pre-war aviators had enjoyed. They entered combat with skills that would have been considered inadequate just years earlier. Lieutenant Yasuhiko Kuroe experienced this decline firsthand when he encountered P-47s for the first time over the Marshall Islands in March 1944. Kuroe had graduated from Sotura Naval Air Station with less than half the flight training that pre-war Japanese pilots had received. His Zero was built with inferior materials that made it even more vulnerable than earlier versions. The Marshall Islands stretched across blue Pacific waters like scattered jewels. Coral atolls rose barely above sea level. Palm trees swayed in constant trade winds. But this tropical paradise was becoming a graveyard for Japanese aviation. American forces were island-hopping toward Japan itself. Each captured base brought enemy fighters closer to the homeland. The engagement was over almost before it began. Kuroe's formation of 6 Zeros was bounced by 4 P-47s that dove out of the sun with devastating effect. The American fighters used their superior speed and firepower to destroy 3 Japanese aircraft in the initial pass. The element of surprise was complete and deadly. The surviving Japanese pilots found themselves unable to effectively retaliate against the armored Thunderbolts. Their 20mm cannons and 7.7mm machine guns seemed inadequate against such heavily protected targets. Shells that should have been fatal merely scratched paint on the American fighters' thick hides. Kuroe managed to score several hits on one of the attacking P-47s. He watched his cannon shells impact the American fighter's wing and fuselage. Bright flashes marked each hit, but to his disbelief, the massive fighter seemed completely unaffected. The Thunderbolt continued its attack as if nothing had happened. Its pilot appeared unaware that he had been hit. Meanwhile, Kuro's own aircraft was critically damaged by a brief burst from the P-47's machine guns. Armor-piercing bullets punched through his Zero's lightweight structure with ease. Engine coolant sprayed across his windscreen. Oil pressure dropped rapidly. The aircraft began losing power and altitude. He was forced to break off the engagement and limp home with a dying engine. This pattern repeated across the Pacific as American air power reached its full devastating potential. Superior aircraft combined with better training and overwhelming numbers proved decisive against Japanese forces that were increasingly outmatched in every category. The technological gap had become so wide that Japanese pilots were essentially flying obsolete aircraft. The P-47 Thunderbolt had become the ultimate symbol of American air superiority. Its massive presence in Pacific skies provided constant reminder of Japanese defeat. The strategic implications were enormous and terrifying for Japanese military planners who had based their entire Pacific strategy on maintaining air superiority. Japanese commanders had assumed they could maintain control of the air through superior pilot skill and aircraft performance. This assumption was the foundation of their entire war plan. Island garrisons could be supplied and reinforced. Naval operations could be conducted under friendly air cover. The failure of this assumption meant Japanese forces throughout the Pacific were now vulnerable to air attack on unprecedented scales. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot of June 1944 provided the most dramatic demonstration of how completely the balance of air power had shifted in America's favor. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese carrier aircraft attempted to attack the American invasion fleet off Saipan. The result was a massacre that effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. P-47s flying from newly captured airfields in the Marshalls played a crucial role in this victory. They intercepted Japanese aircraft before they could reach the American fleet. The Thunderbolt's superior performance and survivability allowed them to engage multiple Japanese formations simultaneously. Dozens of enemy aircraft fell, while the Americans suffered minimal losses. Flight Petty Officer Zenji Abe was one of the few Japanese pilots to survive the Turkey shoot. His account of the battle revealed the hopelessness of fighting against the American fighters. "It was like attacking a fortress with bamboo spears," he later wrote. "Our weapons seemed useless against their armor, while their guns could destroy us with single bursts. We were fighting the previous war, while they had moved on to something entirely new. The technological gap had become so wide that courage and skill meant nothing. Japanese pilots were flying into combat with equipment that was generations behind their opponents. Individual heroism couldn't overcome systematic technological inferiority. The Zero that had seemed so advanced in 1941 was now revealed as a relic of an earlier era. When aerial combat was still considered a contest between individual warriors rather than an industrial process, the Zero had been perfect. But warfare had evolved into something entirely different. Industrial capacity and technological superiority now determined outcomes. American aircraft production reached levels that seemed impossible to Japanese planners. In 1944 alone, American factories produced over 38,000 fighter aircraft. This included thousands of P-47 Thunderbolts rolling off production lines in steady streams. This was more fighters than Japan had produced during the entire war. The quality gap was even more significant than the quantity difference. American fighters incorporated the latest technological advances: self-sealing fuel tanks, armor protection, redundant systems, advanced radio equipment. Japanese aircraft still relied on designs from the late 1930s with minimal improvements. The human cost of this technological revolution was enormous for Japan. The pool of experienced pilots that had taken years to develop was being destroyed faster than any training program could replace them. By late 1944, the average Japanese pilot had less than 100 hours of flight time compared to over 400 hours for his American counterpart. This experience gap was compounded by the P-47's forgiving flight characteristics and excellent survivability. American pilots could make mistakes and live to learn from them. The Thunderbolt's armor and robust construction provided margins for error that simply didn't exist in Japanese aircraft. Mistakes that would be fatal in a Zero were survivable in a P-47. Japanese pilots flying the unforgiving Zero had no margin for error whatsoever. Any mistake could be instantly fatal. Control problems, engine failures, combat damage. All could spell doom for pilots flying aircraft without armor or redundant systems. The result was a death spiral for Japanese aviation that continued until the war's end. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots was perhaps as important as the material advantages enjoyed by their American opponents. Confidence that had carried Japanese aviation through the early war years was being systematically destroyed by encounters with aircraft that seemed immune to their best efforts. Pilots who had once eagerly sought combat now approached each mission with the knowledge that they were likely flying to their deaths. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. Japanese pilot casualties were so high that survival became a matter of pure chance. Skill and experience could no longer guarantee survival against overwhelming American advantages. Major Thomas Maguire of the 475th Fighter Group exemplified the new generation of American aces who built their reputations flying P-47s. Unlike the individualistic approach favored by many early war pilots, Maguire emphasized systematic tactics that maximized his aircraft's advantages while minimizing its weaknesses. The P-47 taught us that aerial combat was about more than just flying skill, Maguire later explained. It was about using superior equipment intelligently, working as a team rather than as individuals, applying overwhelming force at the decisive point. The Japanese were still fighting like knights, while we had learned to fight like soldiers. This professional approach to aerial warfare reflected broader changes in American military culture. Romantic notions of individual heroism that had characterized early aviation were being replaced by systematic approaches. Training emphasized teamwork over individual glory. Tactics focused on intelligent use of superior technology rather than personal courage. The final phase of the Pacific War saw P-47s playing increasingly important roles in the strategic bombing campaign against Japan itself. Flying from bases in the Mariana Islands, Thunderbolts provided escort for B-29 superfortresses on their missions over Japanese cities. The sight of American fighters over the Japanese homeland was a powerful symbol of how completely the war situation had reversed. Japanese attempts to intercept these raids were increasingly futile exercises in desperation. The few remaining experienced pilots were no match for well-trained Americans flying superior aircraft. Inexperienced Japanese pilots were simply slaughtered in encounters with veteran P-47 squadrons. The home islands, once considered invulnerable to air attack, were now under constant assault. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 finally ended the war. But the outcome had been determined much earlier by the systematic destruction of Japanese air power. The P-47 Thunderbolt had played crucial roles in this victory, proving that American industrial might and design philosophy could overcome any advantage in pilot skill or tactical innovation. In the end, the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt in the Pacific was more than just the tale of successful fighter aircraft. It was the story of how American industry and ingenuity had revolutionized aerial warfare forever. Creating aircraft that could survive punishment, that would destroy any previous fighter, while delivering firepower that was overwhelming by earlier standards. Japanese aces who had once mocked American aviation capabilities learned harsh lessons about the realities of industrial warfare. Individual skill and courage, however exceptional, could not overcome systematic application of superior technology and unlimited resources. The age of the warrior pilot was ending, replaced by an era where survival and effectiveness mattered more than individual heroics. The P-47 Thunderbolt had become the symbol of this transformation. Its massive presence in Pacific skies provided constant reminder that the United States had not only matched enemy capabilities, but surpassed them in every meaningful category. The aircraft that Japanese pilots initially dismissed as too heavy and clumsy to be effective had proven to be exactly what was needed. The thunder of the P-47's massive engine had announced a new era in aerial warfare, one where American fighters would dominate skies through superior design, overwhelming firepower, and unmatched survivability. Japanese aces who had stunned the world with early victories found themselves stunned by enemies who refused to play by old rules and had written new ones favoring industrial might over individual excellence. In the quiet of post-war years, as veterans on both sides reflected on their experiences, the lesson of the P-47 Thunderbolt remained crystal clear. In modern warfare, the side with better technology, superior training, and greater resources would ultimately prevail. Regardless of the individual courage and skill of their opponents, it was a lesson that would shape military thinking for generations to come. The P-47 Thunderbolt would be remembered as the aircraft that first demonstrated this fundamental truth in the skies over the Pacific, where warrior traditions met industrial warfare and discovered which philosophy would dominate the future of aerial combat.